Now, it's no surprise that Krytac, subsidiary to Chris USA, makes the most realistic airsoft vector body on the market, and now they've released the gas blowback version, which many people have been waiting for, especially since the KWA gas vector was discontinued for the better part of a decade now. One of the few rifles that offers a working 2-round burst function. That's a lot of fun to play with. It's also nice to be able to actually use all the controls, unlike the AEG, like bolt release and charging handle. With a gun that's so different from the norm, it's nice to properly interact with the vector's eccentric design. This is the Canadian Spec version with a longer 155mm inner barrel, up from 120mm, shrouded in a longer metal outer barrel. Standard 14mm counterclockwise thread under a thread protector. With the extended inner barrel, we were getting between 370 and 380 FPS with standard green gas and 0.2 gram BBs. The longer barrel does change the classic compact vector profile a little bit, but at least it doesn't look quite as ridiculous as some actual firearm vectors we have here in Canada. Also, just like the real one, this one ships without an orange tip. Scary. Taking a quick look through the manual, I've always been impressed with Krytac's detailed instructions, and this one is no exception. For the Canadian Spec version, you get an insert with updated specs, as well as an exploded parts diagram with Canadian Spec parts. It's a small touch that shows attention to detail, even for a smaller niche market. You get the usual walkthrough of basic features like loading magazine and adjusting hop-up, but I'm glad to see detailed takedown instructions and even basic maintenance procedures like which parts need lubrication. A far cry from the short, generic instruction leaflets filled with spelling mistakes that we still see from some brands, and what I'm hoping becomes the norm. Being officially licensed, of course, there is no shortage of trademarks with little V's adorning nearly every surface, and even some where you might not expect them. Only a small Krytac logo and Made in Taiwan markings give a visual indication that it's the Airsoft version. Speaking of markings, I like that the selector markings are embossed into the surface and filled in with a very precise color inlay. It looks really good and probably won't ever wear off. Side by side with this tan AEG vector, they look and feel nearly identical, and by our scale, the gas one is a little bit lighter at 5.2 pounds unloaded versus 5.7 pounds unloaded of the AEG. Somewhat to be expected without a metal mech box inside. The weight is offset by the heavier gas mag at 0.8 pounds, or about double the 0.4 pound AEG magazine, bringing both guns loaded to almost exactly 6 pounds. For reference, a Krytac CRB M4 comes in at about 5.7 pounds, so the polymer vector is surprisingly hefty, but far from unmanageable, with the center of gravity being very centralized. Looking at fit and finish, the gas vector feels excellent, just like Krytac's AEG vector. Give it a good shake and there's barely any sound, mainly the folding charging handle. From what we've heard, the main body is actually borrowed from the 22LR version of the firearm vector, so many parts meant for the 22LR might actually drop into the gas blowback version, but we have not tested it ourselves. Also worth noting that this vector uses a traditional straight blowback design like the 22LR and not the Super V recoil system seen on their 45 and 9mm models. There's no play at all between the upper and lower receiver, and the folding stock locks in with authority and has only a small amount of stock wobble, especially for this type of folding design. Less exciting though is when you pop in the magazine. It does lock in with a great sound and feel, but there is a noticeable amount of play in the magwell. Forward and back is the worst offender, with side to side being a little bit better and up and down play being the best of the three. Looking at the magazine itself, it's a metal body with a plastic shroud around part of the body. There is grip texturing at the front of the magazine, which helps you grip the mag when you hit that release. Green gas is inserted into the back next to the release valve, which is becoming the norm. It features trademarks on the back along with non-functional load indicator holes, which only goes up to 30 rounds, while the true capacity is 60 BBs. Loading track is open at the front with lots of space to line up a speed loader. Just make sure you have a good grip on the follower, as the plastic shroud gets a little bit in the way. Polymer texture on the body will be familiar to Krytac Vector owners, with a relatively smooth matte finish that feels really good to the touch. The black color is very uniform throughout the gun and has a nice cohesive look. However, we did notice it tends to mark pretty easily, for instance underneath the charging handle. Takedown pins are all captured with double metal springs, which is a nice touch to ensure they stay in place. All screw hardware are metric hex screws, which by this point should be the norm, but surprisingly isn't. Lots of rail space up top on that monolithic metal rail for optics, and a metal rail at the 6 o'clock position as well. I like that the screw holes for the 3 and 9 o'clock rail panels have metal threaded inserts, though extra panels need to be purchased separately. Polymer Defiance flip-up iron sights are included, and though we've seen them on Krytac's other guns, I've said it before and I'll say it again, these are one of my favorite polymer flip-ups on the market, with an extremely tactile action both in the folding and in the adjustment dials. I only wish the front sight post was marked with maybe a high-vis color, but I guess you can't have it all. The stock will be familiar to anyone who's owned a Vector, with a dropped butt pad that brings the sights to a nice eye level. One of my favorite features is with the removal of just one pin, you can easily remove the stock and run the Vector as is, which depending on your playstyle might be perfect for you. Should you choose to fold it over, it latches to the side with enough strength to hold the whole gun up and simply tilts upwards to release. A single metal sling point under the stock. The mag release, bolt catch, and charging handle are all grouped together so your offhand can reach them all easily, but it's primarily designed for righties with no controls on the other side, though the old reach around to the other side isn't all too bad. Holding open the chamber manually is easy by pulling the charging handle and pressing the rear of the bolt release. Releasing the bolt has a nice action, but the polymer body gives the bolt kind of a slightly duller sound than we're used to seeing from other gas blowback rifles. Pulling back the charging handle, travel is short but has a satisfying action to it, and with all metal internal components should withstand lots of fiddling with. Worth noting is because of the design, it's pretty tough to chamber check for a BB, so bear that in mind. It's missing the dust cover that you'd find on the AEG, so be careful of dirt or sand getting into the bolt. We can also see that the dummy charging handle from the AEG just isn't quite the same as the gas blowback. Popping in an empty mag to dry fire, the gun cycles super crisp, and it's easy to press down the bolt release to continually dry fire. However, this highlights one potential problem with the ergonomics. For me, my offhand consistently lands on the bolt catch, and a couple times on the range I thought the gun was misfeeding when really the magazine was just empty. On the flip side, when you pop in a mag, the bolt release is placed pretty perfectly to hit with your thumb. Mag release is standard Vector, and that is to say a little bit of a learning curve. It's clearly designed to be fast to drop a mag on the ground and not necessarily for retaining your expensive empty gas magazine. With a bit of practice, it handles just fine, but make sure you get those reps in to avoid accidentally dropping a mag. The pistol grip has a texturing pattern that matches the front of the gun and is really comfortable with lots of space for larger hands. Inside the grip contains an Allen key for hop-up adjustment. It's tightly held in with foam and won't fall out or rattle around. Hop-up is a TDC style through the top rail, and I'm really happy to see it has very positive adjustment clicks. TDC, or top dead center, uses a screw to increase hop-up pressure rather than a lever system, and typically holds settings a little bit better and has less side-to-side variance. Really glad to see it on this Vector. The selector switches are nice and stiff, with both safety and fire rate selectors being ambidextrous. I'm glad companies are putting more attention into how the controls feel to use, and I'm really happy with just how notchy and deliberate these Vector controls are. Looking at the trigger, there is about 1mm of very light take-up before tension ramps up. Brake is more of a rounded brake with steadily increasing tension until the brake right at the end of travel. Reset is almost at the start of travel, so somewhat of a long reset, but has a very well-defined notch. I wish the brake was a bit cleaner and less of a drawn-out pull, but overall it's still very usable and does not detract from the gun. On the range now, it loads up more or less like any other gas gun. Getting a good double stack is a little bit tricky, but par for the course for pistol-style magazines. Chrono readings are pretty consistent with a few outliers, but generally settles into a consistent velocity. Initial shooting impressions are great with a high cyclic rate and very crisp action. However, if you're expecting a heavy blowback, this gun ain't it. To me, it almost feels like an AAP in a carbine kit. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. For gaming use, it handles just about as easily as most AEGs, with the added trigger response and realistic controls. And that fast cyclic rate really fits the run-and-gun submachine gun dynamic. 2-round burst is extremely quick, but of course check your local fields, as many would consider it to be full auto. Still, it's a lot of fun to play with on the range, and overall accuracy is just as good, if not better, than the AEG Vector we've tested. Now, is this the next gun for you? If you've had your eye on a crisp Vector and want a realistic gas gun for the collection, of course you can't go wrong with literally the exact same body as the real 22LR variant. But if you're just looking for a gas gun, I would strongly advise handling one in the store first, as the ergonomics can be hit or miss. As far as shooting performance goes, it's every bit as good as you'd want, and for just kicking back on the range, the 2-round burst definitely has that novelty factor. As always, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed clicking subscribe buttons, and I'll catch you on the next one.